Thank you for joining today. Good afternoon. Hopefully, everyone got a really good lunch. So, this should be the easiest meeting on your docket today. I'd like to thank you for joining us for our virtual Cloud Security Alliance Pittsburgh chapter webinar. My name is Annie Howard. I'll be your host today. I am the Vice President and Secretary of the CSA Pittsburgh chapter. I'm also joined today by the CSA Pittsburgh chapter board members. We have Eric Lansbury, who's our president and treasurer, doing the wonderful financial things that I hate doing. So thank you for that. We also are joined today by Justin Leafline, who will also be our speaker today, has some great content coming. He serves as our membership director. And then Joe Proy, who's our program director with the CSA Pittsburgh chapter. So if you have any questions in those verticals, feel free to reach out to us directly or as a group as well. And so our mission is really to advance security best practices, right? Foster education within our local community and really build strong connections within the Pittsburgh region. Whether you're a member for a while or just joining us today for the first time, we're excited for you to be here with us. Before getting into kind of today's discussion, I would like to make sure that you're aware of some chapter updates. One, our membership does continue to grow with more professionals across many verticals: healthcare, finance, tech, manufacturing. Everyone's getting involved, and we love seeing that. So continue to support, share the love, spread the word with others. We'd love to bring more people along, really get more excitement and engagement as we talk about cloud. I know cloud is very nebulous, but there's always people around talking about all the nerdy things about cloud, whether it's the controls and compliance to actually setting up tools. Also, we have been increasing the number of functions we're having from a social events perspective, as well as starting to add webinars like today and in-person training events. Speaking of which, in about a couple weeks, May 28th, which I think is in 2 Wednesdays, we'll be having a in-person meetup at Alloy 26, the auditorium, which I believe is on the North Shore area. So to give you some geographic representation there. We'll be joined by John Ziola, founder of CISO and Zenable.io. He'll be talking about policy as code, how to get your arms around AI-generated code, how to move things quickly, also break things quickly, but also learn from it, right? And gain insights into how to turn all this chaos into a controllable, scalable structure and be able to, motivate teams to accelerate delivery of services, as well as reduce risk to the organization as it applies to cloud. And if you are able to join us in person, just a friendly reminder, we will be raffling off the CCFK certification voucher for the event. So you must be in attendance to win. So share the love, share the information, because I know if you're like me, you probably have a bunch of certifications that you're trying to pay for, and a voucher really comes in handy. Something else to note too, the presentation portion of the event will start at 6 p.m. promptly. So make sure you're there on time and don't miss any of the action. Also, speaking of speakers and webinars, if you are interested or have others that are also interested, we would love to talk to you. We would love to understand if you have someone that would be a great speaker for us. We would love to talk about sponsoring options as well as volunteering for CSA Pittsburgh. So if you know anyone that is interested, trying to add value to the local community, or just wants to get more involved with security, like-minded, cloud-minded people, please send them to our website, csapgh.org, or you can find us on LinkedIn through our LinkedIn group. And of course, if you know us on LinkedIn, you can certainly DM us. Just a little plug, I am the worst social media person, but I will do my best to respond promptly to you. Now, we are the Pittsburgh chapter, so kind of bringing it up to the CSA Global, just a few exciting things that are happening with the Cloud Security Alliance at the global level that I just want to touch on. One of the items is the Cloud Controls Matrix, the CCM. We got version 4. To kind of summarize what's happening there, all the controls in that framework are really aligned to the security guidance for cloud computing. There's a lot of new tech, and it's moving fast. And there's quite a bit of an attack surface that we're going to have to work together as an organization and individually and throughout the entire different industry verticals within cyber. And so you may want to take a look at that. We can drop some links out in the chat for you and follow up post event to give you some more information. But I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that because you're probably inundated with a bunch of spam, and it's helpful to get some of these verbal notes to pay attention to. We also wanted to touch on the STAR program, the Security, Trust, Assurance, and Risk Registry, which I know that's a lot, so STAR. It's really a publicly accessible registry that documents all the security and privacy controls provided by all of the cloud computing offerings. So if you don't know where to start, that might be a great place to start to get more abreast on the types of security and compliance controls that you want to learn or understand in the cloud environment. And then also incorporate some of the key principles around the transparency of what you're doing in cloud, auditability, harmonizing all of those standards so that you're able to link those back to the cloud controls matrix or the CCM. I know I've been using it with some of the things that we've been working on in my environment, and it does become a nice guidance and guardrails for you to really demonstrate progress in reducing risk to the organization. And then lastly, artificial intelligence is a huge hot topic. I know everyone is either super paranoid about it or they're embracing it with arms wide open. But one of the things to kind of keep in mind, there is going to be working groups. Some have already started. I'm sure there will be sub disciplines within AI as it pertains to cloud security. The CSA AI Safety Initiative is really becoming embedded with all the cloud platforms, promoting some of the responsible innovation that we want to have. AI is really great to accelerate delivery of solutions, but also opens us up to risk. And so we need to figure out ways to combat that risk and mitigate that to our businesses. So keep an eye out for all the new information. We also have some other hot topics like zero trust. I know all these buzzwords are probably flying through in your organizations as well. Cloud supply chain risks. So definitely keep an eye on the CSA Knowledge Center for new resources and training. And of course, your local Pittsburgh chapter could be a great place for you to get that information in a more streamlined fashion. So today's webinar, oh my gosh, I'm really excited, Justin, to hear what you have to say. I know that it has been a long time coming to kind of share some of this information with us in this format. So I'm going to hand it off to you here, sir. And without further ado, let's go ahead and dig into some of the segmentation, the tagging, and how we make audits smoother and smarter and faster for you.
Great. Yeah, let me share my screen here real quick. All right. Can everybody see my screen here?
We can.
Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you. Today, I really wanted to go over a little bit more from a governance/auditor perspective of how you should be looking at segmentation within the cloud, how you can isolate different processing and different regulatory and or compliance segments, how do you properly kind of separate out different trust areas, within your cloud here. If you're familiar with the cloud, a lot of this will be kind of going over, traditional stuff that you're probably already familiar with. But my kind of angle onto this is from an auditor perspective, how you should be thinking about this. A lot of auditors are not very well versed. They're still in the traditional realm of put a firewall on and you got a segmentation, into that. And there's a lot of other different aspects, into this. And I want to give mainly, with 20, 30 years, into the future, we're looking at, first principles of this, and we'll cover on, the questions you should be asking on to validate whether it's segmented good or not, into that. And really that's going to be the guiding light onto here. But first, if you're not familiar with me, Justin Leapline, currently I'm running a PCI, doing a lot of governance consulting, plus building a tool for smaller organizations to help with their compliance and governance needs. I'm also an IANS faculty member, And if you listen to podcasts, we started one up that's been running for a year now, called Distilled Security Podcast, where I have a couple of co-hosts and we talk about different security topics, while drinking, of course, into this. Have kind of a big history on kind of dipping in and out of consulting, from being in BOI Mellon into third-party risk management to Diebold, ahead of their entire GRC organization there. Gift cards, I led the security program there, and Trusted Sec, I was key in their advisory leading up their PCI program. So, got a wealth of experience, into this to bring you today. But first, we're going to cover a little bit of the past here. So, this is me probably circa 1983, I believe it is, 82, 83. I know I'm really cute. This is probably gonna, just sell the whole presentation to you here, but this is just quintessential 80s here. I love the carpet on the wall, the pencil on top of the computer, and actually this was a portable computer here that my dad brought home. He used to work for a DEC, I believe, at the time. And this was the you put a case on it and you could wheel it around like a luggage, through an airport and everything, with this. So this is my exposure, through computers. It was always kind of in and around me. And even so that my dad actually in the early 90s set up the first internet service provider in the North Pittsburgh area. We had it all on platforms of the pizza boxes, if anybody's familiar with the Sun Spark stations and everything. We had several of these kind of set up, into this, set up the first internet service provider north of Pittsburgh. And I remember vividly, we turned our garage into basically a modem bank into this, and we had like 10 modems that we set up originally into this, and it turned quickly into, oh, we got one customer in, we got two customers in, to, oh, look, we have one empty modem, and then it got filled up again, and just trying to keep up with customer demand, through the mid 90s and everything. So I bring this up, with this because, when we're talking about cloud and how it's kind of, operated, if we look just 30 years ago, it was way different. In fact, into the early 2000s, you building up your kind of infrastructure, at least for me, was going onto eBay and looking for 123U, computers, and finding a data center next to you to go plug it in and everything like that. This was typical in, kind of small business of what we were doing to, get operational running. You would get the Microsoft licenses for, and hopefully you could get the school educational discount where you got all the CDs and got to install all the Microsoft products for free, essentially into that. And then like early 2000s, kind of hit, and there would be hosting platforms where they would kind of rent out a server for you, but there would be like a dozen other customers that would be living right next to you on this server and try to kind of, segment it out and everything. The reason why I kind of do this is, segmentation is going to change. From the 90s, networking was throw it up on the internet and give it a public IP address, whether it's a printer or an endpoint, into this. And now there's a lot more complexity and capabilities, honestly, into this. But really, when it comes down to it, it's all about kind of the core principles of how you're appropriately segmenting something from not affecting the environment or not having access to the environment into that. So why does cloud kind of, upset this, the traditional scope into this? If anybody's ever gone to an AWS conference, this is plastered on, I think, every employee's like forehead and every presentation that you'll see, but it's a shared responsibility model. This is one of the core things that no matter what cloud, this is AWS's, but each, major cloud service provider have this concept into it where, it's not all AWS's side or your side. There's a shared responsibility model, and it goes deeper into what services you're digesting, how it's architected, what you're kind of allotting into that. But the concept is you need to understand where your responsibilities lie versus where your service providers' responsibilities lie, into this. And it gets further into that as we get into different architecture types, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, type of thing. You're paying somebody else to do services for you. So if you're launching a EC2 server, onto the AWS platform, you obviously have a lot of responsibility of patching, configuration, minimizing, the baseline to be secure, everything along that lines. But if you're using Lambda functions where it's just running a piece of your code, into that environment, a lot of those responsibilities drop off and push it to the cloud service provider, into there. So that's an important concept to understand and to model out when you're looking at, doing scoping into this. And we're looking even into here with the various different models, the different areas between the different architectures and where they kind of blend together with this. Other things that kind of impact scoping, when we're talking about this, we're looking at like resources that are here and gone, pretty quickly, into this. And we're also looking at like scaling. So, things that, was very slow back in the day to scale, you would actually have to add a physical asset, to scale up or do certain things like that. Now with, a lot of the different cloud architectures, you can add assets programmatically, oftentimes into your scoping. So I've gotten a lot of conversations when you're looking at this, when assets are subtracted and added on a whim of whatever the scale is that you're measuring, either CPU, bandwidth, whatever it may be. How can you kind of incorporate that into your scope when it's always changing scope into that? And there's ways absolutely to do that where the auditor would clearly understand, and say, okay, yeah, we have a group of assets here. It's typically two assets, but can grow up to 12, when, demand actually peaks, into this. Okay. So one thing we want to cover is, where does scope land? Because there's a lot of different things that actually take interest into scoping, and then there's certain things that really don't, or they're very light on. So one of the things I've had, the most experience with, I would say, to date, is PCI. PCI is very particular on scoping. They've come out with multiple documents. It's in their core documentation on what they're talking about when they talk about scoping. Scoping follows first and foremost the data, into this, and then it goes into what connects into that environment, where those kind of boundaries are, everything along that line. So it's very particular, into that, and has a very clear outline, to what can is incorporated into that. HIPAA, less so. One of the things while doing research for this presentation here, I want to make sure that, I was giving it clear. Obviously, anything that's processing PHI, into this is obviously in scope and providing services to that. But HHS doesn't provide a clear what else, into this. They don't have any kind of scoping, to say also these assets here that might not touch PHI. If it's in the service realm, you should include it into that. But typically, if you have an asset, let's say right next to your Active Directory authentication service that has nothing to do potentially with PHI, that asset wouldn't be covered under that there. So just keep that in mind that some are less picky, but we're also going to talk about doing when we're talking about more of the scoping and making it justifiable. So whether reach the low bar or not, you should be doing something that would be defensible to any auditor, into those cases there. SOC 2 is probably even less so into that. So they're looking at more of the services affecting that. But if it's on the service that what you're scoping out and related to providing that service, it's not in scope for that SOC 2. In fact, there's really no requirement, to actually provide segmentation between the assets providing service and the assets not providing service, into there. And then you're looking at like 853. I've done a number of assessments for various different agencies, into that. And, they're kind of full scope, but they split it up on the various boundaries, that you would set into there. So I've worked with a number of different, agencies where this boundary is all your AV equipment, so your audio, video, all that stuff. And then they'll do their IT, endpoints as a a scope into that and cover kind of all their assets, but in various scopes, driven down into there. So PCI scoping, like I said, very particular. They cover first data, then connected to or security impacting systems, and then they kind of put it into, then if it doesn't hit any of these, then it could be considered out of scope. One of the most confusing things with PCI is if you look at the bottom out of scope systems there, the third kind of, squarish, there that system components cannot connect to any system within the CDE. Now, that is a very rigid, requirement into that. I will tell you it's for any good QSAs or auditors into the field, there are gray areas into that. Obviously, if it's security impacting and can connect into a system through an administrative or alter security settings, it would obviously be in scope. But there have been a number of times where if it's just pulling non-PCI data, like I just had a recent example where something was reaching into the PCI environment. It had limited access only to pull day end books, for all the transactions, and that's all the data that it gathered, no PCI data or anything like that. And that access was limited to that, which we validated, into there. That was allowed, into there, and that didn't increase the scope, from that asset that's pulling in, with that. So there are ways, to limit that. Like I do a common example of like heartbeat or, uptime monitoring. If it's reaching into the PCI zone, but not really accessing the systems, in any, access, it's just, pinging the systems or anything like that, that's not considered in scope, into there. So there are ways to get around it, but some auditors will take it very rigidly, and will say any access whatsoever means it's in scope, into there. And I should say, if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to drop in the comments there. I'll try to address it, or raise your hand or come off mute, to interrupt me during this talk here. So let's talk about some of the like fundamental things that we're talking about here. So there's obviously the traditional network constructs. These are the firewalls, the VPCs, the subnets, access controls. Into this. These are the ones that's looking at various ports, protocols, IP addresses, network segments, and giving allows, not allows, for these various access and everything. This is 101. If you ever take the SIFs, they're like, this is, core fundamentals into this. They're not going away. There's always going to be, a place for them, in a lot of this stuff here. So just, that's kind of 101 into this. Also, two identity constructs. This is if you ever look at the AWS well architected, there's a series of layers between organizational units and accounts to architect it well between these different borders of authentication. This is also a great way to kind of make sure that from this kind of template, to make sure that everything is scoped well and into the appropriate trust zones with that. Um, we're going to be covering a little bit about tagging and resource groups and how to best leverage, some of that stuff. And then landing zones and guardrails, from, architecting like organizational units from a landing zone perspective to make sure you're, have the appropriate access, and guardrails, making sure that appropriate configs are enforced and making sure that there's no deviations into there. So a couple other things that you should be aware of, shared services, VPCs. We're going to be talking about, for these services that are, that are absolutely necessary, logging, security, authentication. Oftentimes these are connected through, shared services, and connecting those into that, into the appropriate network groups and things of that nature. Also, micro segmentation, when you're talking about like Kubernetes or things of that nature, like segmenting with namespaces and enforcing network policy onto that. another way of doing this. Just want to be familiar with some of these concepts here. And then multi-account, multi-subscription, depending on the cloud service provider, you're in, getting segmentation along that lines. And then one thing that I'm just going to lightly talk about here, there are edge and serverless patterns like Lambda functions. By default, a lot of these are self-run in their own environment and require no segmentation. Now, you can open those up and kind of connect it to different services now, into this. But by default, they run in their own isolated areas into that. So a nice way of looking at a segmented workload if getting putting those through and everything. So here's an example that I pulled out of some of the documentation coming from AWS. So this is a very high level concept, of a multi-account strategy into this, specifically about carving off PCI, account data, but can be applicable to any type of segmentation strategy into here. So as you can see, you got 3 accounts that are split up between security, shared services, and logging, pulling in the various services into each of those. And then you have your basically segmented area that you want to protect in that orange box into that. And then you have other related services, but isn't as critical and, and you don't want to include into that scoping asset, into there. So generally speaking, then they're all kind of interconnected on what's business justified and needed for the operation to run and limited into that with all the monitoring that goes along with it. Now, this is high level. Um, and then you kind of can break it down into even more granular. So this is typically what I've seen from a good scoping from a PCI, customer employing, a good security architecture into this. So you'll see, they're highly utilizing organizational units, and then the various accounts that would be underneath those, and very clear naming convention, into this. So shared services, network prod account, you can see the various, components of the cloud service provider that would be incorporated into each of these and running the various things. Now, there's a lot of ways to kind of skin a cat, into this. There's no reason to, you know, do it exactly like this. This is a very logical way, into here. But if you wanted something where you really wanted to split off, let's say you had your own dedicated encryption team, well, maybe your key management system shouldn't belong with your identity center there. And it would make sense to also split that off into its own account. So there's a lot of ways that you need to kind of mesh this with your own organizational structure and making sure it's split off into, need to know and need to access, into these various environments. And then obviously they have a lot of, test, areas, non-prod, and those aren't included into the scope of this. Obviously, that's precluded that you're not using production data into those accounts and everything. Okay.
Justin, I do
Yeah.
have a question. Would you mind kind of going back there? So, CSA recognizes that there are different groups of organizations in terms of sizing. And so, like, going back to your scoping,
Yep.
what are you seeing in terms of scoping of requirements and compliance, right? Some of these larger organizations, they may be on a journey of cloud where they're bringing this as a complementary hosting environment with their current, I'll say, on-prem data
Yeah.
centers.
Hmm.
Are you seeing kind of the scopes encroach into kind of the on-premise because there, typically there would be ways to interconnect these things in a hybrid hosting environment? I'm curious of your thoughts and trends that you're seeing in
Yep.
that space.
Yeah, so later in probably a few slides and everything, one of the things I bring up is follow the bouncing ball strategy, into this. So when you're dealing with either a data or a service kind of scoping strategy, you're looking at what can actually impact, that data or service, into there. And you're absolutely right when you're kind of blending the on-prem versus cloud. There will be things that will, pull, one or both into scope, depending on what that is, with that. So we have a number of things like I've seen clients where, they'll bring back backups, onto their on-prem. Obviously, it has, reliability and a security aspect, into there. They'll do administrative, or I've seen dedicated pipelines back to like corporate locations, so that, they can get rid of kind of the multi-factor and tie to a location, into that. There's a lot of things that can kind of spiral, when you're looking at scoping. That we could talk about this probably all day, into this,
Of
but
course.
the important thing is to understand kind of the flow in the data and the services. And if it does blend on-prem versus cloud, then you have to incorporate that, into the scope and make sure that that you look at that. One of the things that I'll bring up just a little bit later, I won't go too deep into it, but one of the first principles of this is if I'm sitting on a out of scope asset, I should not be able to, one, get any of the sensitive data that's incorporated into that scope, and two, not interfere with anything from a security perspective, into there. So if it follows that, then generally you can carve it out of scope, into there. But if there is a way where, yeah, you're given an admin, like I've had cases where I mentioned that pull request with that. I've had clients where a similar scenario where we start looking at authentication of what's doing that pull, and they give it full admin to the server to do a simple pull for end of day books, or something like that. And then we're like, nope, that's not appropriate, because if anybody has that account that's outside of the scope, they could change security settings. They could, interrupt that. They could potentially, drill into it and, definitely go into, that in scope area, with that access there. So yeah, it all depends on your architecture and all that stuff there. Okay. Um, a couple of like future readings, into this. And I, you know, I'm very familiar with like AWS into this. There are similar documentation, I will say, to other cloud service providers, obviously, with that, with Microsoft and Google. Don't feel like this is just, you should go AWS, into this. There are a lot of complementary different services between the cloud service providers. You just have to find what that kind of translates to and what the capabilities are into that. But normally speaking, like all this is achievable into any of the different providers into that. There's some differences. I will point out that definitely look at like some of the regulatory or compliance documentation. I brought up, PCI compliance here has one specifically on segmentation and scoping. It walks you through basically a flow chart of if it can do this, it can do this, then it's in scope, which is actually helpful when you're logically thinking about segmentation, borders and everything. AWS has a slew of documentation. I cited some of the charts that were in here from an architecting, scoping and segmentation at AWS. Some of those graphs are from that middle document there. And then looking at architected solution, there's a lot of different things within there. So going into like the scoping methodology here. So this is where we were talking about a little bit of first principles and all that stuff. So this is my guiding person. Anytime I'm consulting with somebody, there's a lot of different variations. I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of unique situations where clients are like, well, what about this? And what about this? And here's how I convey the first principle of this. If a malicious person is sitting on a not in scope asset, can they gain access to sensitive data or degrade the security of the in-scope assets, into that. Now, I put an asterisk onto that because, everybody always says, well, what about the 0 day that we don't know about or something like that? It's within foreseeable, access. Forget about the 0 day that gives access to everything, from the movie Sneakers or something along that lines. If the premise of your patching, access controls are good, everything is as to be expected, and your controls are running effectively, can they log in and degrade the security of that asset? If the answer is no to both of these, generally speaking, you consider it an out of scope asset, into this. So this is where you kind of follow kind of the defensible segmentation and scoping principles. And with any auditor, if you can definitively say and prove that the answer is no, to both of these, then you have a good argument to say it is appropriately segmented scope from our assets that we're trying to, preclude from whatever that scoping is, or just from a security trust perspective. And I mentioned this lightly before. If you're doing kind of a data-centric scoping instead of a service scoping into this, first things first is you follow the bouncing ball of data, into this. So, where does data first get ingested? Where is it getting processed? Where is it getting sent to? What data lakes is it going through? Is it structured? Is it unstructured? Is it going over email? Is somebody storing it on a share drive? The, we've seen it all, in the industry here, but you have to first follow the bouncing ball to kind of know the core assets that are in scope. And then you kind of start going out from there. Once you identify that these three servers have cardholder data or whatever that sensitive data is that you care about, PHI, whatever, then you can start looking at it and say, okay, here are the three assets. Now, what supports this? What's providing the segmentation controls into there? And kind of go out from that aspect. So, once you have those core assets, then you're looking at those trust zones. So, if that data store tier is where cardholder data is being stored, what else is sitting on that tier? Where's the segmentation lines between that tier and the application tier? Does cardholder data even exist in the application tier, or is that a pass through encryption, into that? These are the kind of, walkthroughs that you're looking at to start to define your scope and to make it defensible, into this. So with defensible boundaries, you definitely want to use kind of native constructs into this. This is where we're getting into like organizational units and account days. So tagging groups, into this, subnet tiers, account subscription per risk tier, organizational units. Um, Breaking this out into those structures and then putting kind of, rules in and around that is great. So when you're doing like tagging groups, you can actually go through and put, for the data store tier with a tag of PCI in scope, into that, they would get these ACLs that would be applied onto it with in and out, lockdown with that. So anytime you're rolling a new asset into that group there, they're automatically being applied the correct ACLs that would be appropriate into that group there with that. And make sure you're validating that, there's tools within the cloud service providers that will help you kind of analyze to make sure that your rules that you're applying into that are valid and true and is what you're expecting, from that design there. And then from a document, segmentation, John Ciola will be talking more as this, with like policy as code, using Terraform, things of that nature. But the nice thing about those is all your, segmentation controls that are in there are documented as part of the rollout of those policy as code, with that. So you can quickly look at those, validate those, and provide those as evidence into that aspect there. Um, um, and using platforms as like Wiz, you can help to validate, some of those as well. Some things too that I wanted to bring up that it I've seen it here and there, but it's definitely not done commonly, but should probably be done more often, is actually incorporating tests into your segmentation within your pipeline. You know, as you're rolling out new code, you can actually do different tests into that. I've seen like POI tests and scripts used to, you know, poke and prod at different segments that you're rolling out through your policy as code. I've seen different, you know, just using different tools to make sure that the rules that you're putting in is actually validated into your rollout, you know, into this. And it's great when somebody, you know, fat fingers something or, you know, does an incorrect configuration path and you're not exposing yourself into that area and it's caught before it actually goes out into production into this. And then one of the requirements, you know, that obviously PCI, like we mentioned, is big onto this, is penetration testing is required, you know, from for most PCI. You get less if you do certain models in the self-assessment questionnaires, but generally speaking, it's one of the requirements within in PCI and with penetration testing for the internal aspect, you need to be testing from your out of scope, you know, areas to in scope areas to make sure that segmentation, that's specifically what it's for with penetration testing, is to validate the segmentation testing into that. And a lot of people actually don't know the PCI recommendation from a pen test. You don't actually have to test inside the cardholder data area. You just have to test the border of it. Now, if you get in, you can continue the penetration test from within your data store or wherever you're processing cardholder information, but it's only required to be at the perimeter of that to make sure that your segmentation controls are operating effectively. Okay. So time 47, doing good. So some of the evidence, you know, that we're looking at with this. So current diagrams, I showed some of the diagrams with this. So there's a lot of diagram data that you can actually pull from cloud service providers that have like baseline, and then you can modify in your, you know, favorite Visio slash draw.io asset list. A lot of those, obviously, with PCI is required. With other programs, it's good to have. So you have the common language of how things are designed and should be operating within your design. Um, with this. Some kind of wins. There are some stuff that you can generate diagrams, you know, from your code and everything. They're not the prettiest, you know, at the end of the day, but they can, with a little manipulation, get the job done, you know, into that. And looking at kind of, you know, any differences that are reported like on segmentation, you know, into this. And then, you know, some testing and attestation. We mentioned a little bit about doing some of the continuous integration tests and penetration segmentation tests, and just making sure that, you know, on the results of those, you're dumping it into logs and you can actually prove isolation or that it's failing into that and then raise up flags as appropriate. Just a couple of like final things, you know, from a, you know, scaling and scoping that I did want to mention. We mentioned about, you know, putting some of the guardrails, you know, onto this. So there's a lot of things you can do to enforce this, like doing AWS config, you know, to make sure that your appropriate configs are enforced into there and have the option that it can actually do remediation. So if you drop it into CloudTrails and then kick off like a Lambda function, you can automatically do remediation to, you know, fix any configs that are, you know, at fault into that. You know, obviously that takes a little bit of setup, but you know, if you get to that spot where, you know, you're enforcing your rules, no matter what the drift may be, then that would be a great place, you know, to kind of be in. From a change management perspective, as you're pushing out policies as code, make sure that things are as expected into that and that you're forcing those expectations. So I put up just an example here, like if there are no labels on some of the assets that are being pushed up, you know, into that, fail, into that. You can do GitHub action very easily, into there. And I also put it, paired with branch protection and code owners. I've seen with code owners that in some of the aspects, if you're pushing up different, ACLs or limitations or something along that lines, if there are changes, I've seen where they'll require security as a reviewer through the pipeline before it actually gets promoted, into that and gets escalated up to, production at the end, into there. So that's a great way if there's changes that need to be done. It doesn't require somebody just to remember to include security. If there are any changes into around the areas where security would be concerned about, segmentation creep or things of that nature, they would automatically be flagged into a team and then would have responsibility to go up and review, that they're not opening it up to the world, that the changes are appropriate to the, the what the scope changes, etc. So a great way to kind of utilize a common workflow into that. And then, obviously looking at periodic, triggers for this. So anything new, that's outside the kind of wrapped, like we've already made decisions out of this, would obviously require a little bit more architecture and decision making into that. So different data types, different services, obviously merger acquisitions, going into different regions, looking at, what it would be impacting maybe from a privacy perspective or different country laws or something along that line. So, okay. So a couple of quick wins that, you can take away from this, definitely a tagging strategy would help, into this. I didn't want to like go too deep into it. Definitely look at some of the documentation and or go to John Ciola's presentation there. I'm sure he'll, definitely talk about some of this stuff with it. But a lot of the times you can actually tie tagging strategies to what we mentioned with particular ACLs and policy into this. Great way to kind of, limit that area with different similar workflow assets and everything along that lines. Doing security control policy, deny list, or service control, with that boundary checks within continuous integration. All these are kind of quick wins that you can do to start to deploy and get a better sense into your environment. A couple of things I just want to mention, don't forget about like various SaaS that might be integrated. The one of the issues I've seen with customers that we'd have to deal with is just organizations just installing something from the AWS marketplace and then running, with it. There definitely has to be some process into that and making sure, that you can hopefully detect it, when that goes on, with it. Overly permissive peering, where things are just wide open between certain different assets, and then assets that might not be utilized anymore that just hang around that nobody's really cleaned up, after their expiration date, into that. And lastly, and we'll handle any questions if you have any. Just want to kind of bring up that there's common things if you are doing segmentation in the cloud that you should probably be following into this. So label-driven rule sets, as we mentioned to that. So putting things in commonality and applying the same rule sets to those common asset groups into there. Layered enforcement, so looking at network ACLs as well as identity, isolation combined. So this would be via account and or, organizational unit. I've seen ones just do account. If you're small enough, you just have a few accounts. As you grow up and have, a variety of different, assets and services and all that stuff, you have better control over, the organizational type model, into that. And then automation where you can, making sure you're doing tags, guardrail, and automatically tying to a RA design segmentation model and enforcing any drift to go back to the original design there. And with that, we have 5 minutes with this. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat room, or if you want, you can come off mute and I'd be happy to answer it.
Yeah, so I'm looking at our participants. I don't see anyone coming off mute yet. Eric or Joe, do you see any questions in the chat that we can bubble up?
None at this time. Chat looks pretty clean. Everybody's
Okay.
tired from their lunch that they just had, of course.
Yeah. I opted to eat lunch after this meeting because I would probably be, hyped on carbohydrates here. Well, Justin, I think it's pretty amazing, to be honest, that there's just so many different controls and things to think about at various levels of abstraction, right? I'm hearing a little bit of these scopes problem, like it may intrude back into your on-premise environment if you're at, going into a hybrid hosting and growing into these cloud areas. And then also, I just find it a little overwhelming that, cloud security practitioners have such a huge job because now, there's compliance and then the act of actually reducing risk to the organization, and sometimes don't always align to each other, especially if you work in an area where you may have some conflicting regulatory, commitments. I've experienced that myself, where you look at one and you say do this, and then you look at another and you do something different. So I think that kind of ties back to the Cloud Security Alliance and how we have that open repository of attestations and questionnaires that kind of help bring people together in a common knowledge set of these are the expectations. So I loved your first principle. Like, this is the foundation first principle. Like, if they can access it, you probably have a problem you need to address, right? So I really appreciate you highlighting all those problems.
Yeah, and I can't, I mean, like I said, I deal with a lot of different customers, and especially around scoping, because, everybody's like, I have this unique, situation here. And yeah, I help them bring it back to, okay, here are the founding principles. Now explain to me how they can't do this. Like, look at those two bullet points. You have to prove to me that they can't do that, type of thing. And if they can go through and walk through it, then great, we can call it, properly segmented, into that. But yeah, oftentimes it's over permissive accounts, or, ACLs that are wide open, or whatever it may be. And it's like, yeah, that fails that test, into that. And then you work on remediation if you're interested, at that point. So yeah.
Right. Well, again, thank you so much for the information today and really helping us feel hopefully a little less overwhelmed, and being able to take all of these problems and succinctly communicate how to go back to basics and really define, what's the most pressing risk and items to really look at. One final ask I have for folks that are attending today. Again, thank you so much for taking the time and supporting your local Pittsburgh chapter of Global Security Alliance. We do welcome you to continue to join us in future sessions. So please take a moment, if you haven't already, become a member or join and follow our group on LinkedIn. We would love to see you in our upcoming event at Alloy 26 on May 28th, and bring some colleagues and friends as well. We would love to talk to them and help to embrace some of the challenges together and join arms in our tenacity that we must have to really offer these transparent controls to our businesses. So again, everyone, thanks so much for your support and the love. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.